This podcast is brought to you by Osprey Approach. In conveyancing, fixed fees mean every minute counts. Too much admin eats into your profits, and inefficiencies slow transactions down. Osprey Approach is a legal software built for law firms, helping conveyancers stay in control by managing cases, accounts, documents, and compliance all in one place. From automated client updates to post-completion workflows, Osprey streamlines every step, cutting admin time and keeping transactions moving. Osprey Approach. We make running a law firm easier.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Conveyancer podcast, a very special edition of the podcast because we're talking all about the recently published Law Society practice note. This is hot off the press, and I have with me today Dan Montagnani to discuss it. Dan, probably pretty familiar to a lot of listeners, former CEO of Groundsure, now doing some consultancy in and around the sector, including with a company called Map Impact. And Dan, great to have you on the podcast. Really appreciate you joining to share some of your thoughts and reaction, I guess, to the practice note.
Hi, David. Yeah, thanks for having me. And great to be here. Looking forward to getting into some of the detail of the recently published practice notes, and long awaited. In 2022, the Law Society published some general guidance on climate change for the legal sector per se. That's now been followed up with a specific property sector practice note, with obviously a bit more prescriptive guidance for lawyers around the matter of climate change.
It's a matter of huge contention for property lawyers, and we'll probably get into a bit of that. But first, I introduced you as the former CEO. I think people probably know you've moved on. What have you been doing with yourself in the interim?
I had a few weeks off. So when I stepped back from the role at Groundsure, it was middle of summer. So it was nice and sunny. My girls were on school holidays, so took the opportunity to have a couple of months time out and time to reflect on things and do a few bits and pieces that I've not had a chance to do whilst working. So that was lovely. And then since then, I've been working on a few different projects, generally around the geospatial and sustainability climate agenda, working with a few different businesses, doing some advisory stuff. And like you said, I think in the introduction, I'm currently chair at a business called Map Impact. Map Impact is a climate data analysis business with particular expertise around things like biodiversity and wildfire, which obviously we'll probably come onto that a bit shortly, pretty topical.
We're talking in the week or so after the wildfires on Dartmoor. There were extensive issues last year as well, up closer in my neck of the woods, over the moors near Manchester. Let's dive right in, though, to what the practice note now says. And I guess more importantly, and to a point that you made just before we were recording, what it doesn't say.
Just to be particularly clear of this, I was not on the editorial panel or anything like that. So around the subject matter, obviously saw the party to the more general guidance issued back in 2022 by the Law Society on climate change. And I suppose from that, it was, relatively, you had a good idea of what would be covered in a property specific practice note. And we knew that was coming. Now it's here, it's good. Obviously, the first thing it does really is provide clarification around a number of different things. Obviously, it starts really by talking about climate change and some of the sort of obvious things around that. It moves on to talk about how to advise a client. Obviously, that's the important stuff. It then goes on and considers some different scenarios, different types of transactions, and therefore how climate change risks can play out in those different types of scenarios. And it sort of concludes by talking in a bit more detail about valuations, what RICS are doing. Obviously, RICS have got a bit of a sort of parallel stream on this. And other types of surveys that you may be interested in if a property is particularly at risk of climate change. The practice note itself also comes with a secondary sort of guidance note, if you like, which goes on to sort of clarify a few things. There's two things I'd draw out from the practice note that I think are interesting. I think, first of all, the fact that we have a practice note obviously provides clarity for all concerned. So that's good. Of course, by having a practice note, it kind of demarcates what the kind of expectation is on a property solicitor, a property lawyer, and on what might not be an appropriate actions to take. So it kind of gives that frame of reference, what the expectation is, and equally, obviously, what the expectation isn't. And I think that's useful. In several places, makes the point that property lawyers are not climate experts, and nobody's expecting them to be climate experts. And if anything, it's important to make that clear to the client in the retainer. But what it does do is draw on the aspects of where climate change can result in different types of risks, both physical and transition risks, and importantly, how they can play through into legal liabilities. And of course, those should be reported to the client. I think the other interesting thing that the practice note does, and both the practice note and the guidance note that accompanies it, is it goes to the point that climate change risks are not just flooding. I think up until this point, we've obviously focused a lot in the UK on climate consequences being flooding, which obviously is common sense because 1 in 6 properties are at risk of some degree of flooding. But I think typically flood risk generally in the UK is not a catastrophic outcome. I appreciate that obviously there have been circumstances where very serious things have happened, and let's not downplay those. But in the main, flooding is some damage to property and therefore likely an insurance claim. Obviously, hopefully, properties are covered by insurance. We've had the flood re thing and everything else, but we don't lose properties completely as a result of flooding, unlike perhaps in other parts of the world where that has been the case. So I think it's interesting that up until this point, we've had a lot of focus on flooding, and rightly so, and we've got flood defences and flood resilience measures that may be incorporated into flooding scenarios for properties affected by flooding. We have the flood re, the flood insurance industry. We have better, could be better, but better planning guidance around when to build and where to build and not to build in the floodplain, etc. But I think what the practice note gets to is it gets into the sort of acknowledgement that it's not just flood risk in the UK. And that's, I think, an interesting area because at the moment, most climate searches tend to major on flooding as the kind of consequence of climate change. And so there's a recognition that things like wildfire, which of course is a potentially catastrophic risk for a property, and things like drought and water stress and heat stress in urban environments are also material climate risk consequences in the UK. It is, in some circles, people are now referring to a UK wildfire season, which happens early spring onwards. That's kind of interesting to think about because maybe 5 years ago, 3 years ago, we wouldn't necessarily have thought like that. But we've all seen occasional wildfires and stuff over the years. But these things happen with increasing frequency. And it's the frequency and the likelihood of these things affecting property that I think is interesting. Of course, look, these aren't great headlines. We break records all the time now. We've had the hottest 1st of May, I think, ever on record. We had the 4 home countries with their own wildfire situations before Easter this year. So these are records that continue to manifest, and none of them are generally particularly great news, but they're here, and it's the reality. And I think the practice note now acknowledges a broader set of climate risks, physical risks, and that's something that I think the industry is going to have to adjust to, because right now the industry isn't generally focusing on all things, and it's important that we don't just think about flood risk, we also think about these other perils and risks, and of course some of those can have greater consequence. So it may be less likely or less frequent, affect less properties, but when they do happen, the consequences are potentially far more serious. So those would, I'd say, the 2 areas that I think are interesting about practice note. One is that we have clarification on what is and is not expected, and 2, there's an acknowledgement, a very real acknowledgement, I think, that climate change risk for UK property, in respect of UK property, is not just flooding, it's a series of related weather-driven perils.
Vacancy Legal Recruitment, a refreshingly unique and personal talent agency developed specifically for legal. Dedicated to the sector and with extensive experience working across legal services and legal technology, we bridge the gap between your requirements and top-tier legal talent. Get in touch today and say hello at vacancy.co.uk.
And I don't want to bang on about flooding because, as you rightly point out, there are wider issues. But if we take the wording in the guidance that was published in 2022, lawyers should address increasing flood risk incidents, cost and availability of insurance, and how this affects the decision to buy and the price. This feels like a sizable responsibility on the conveyancer's shoulders that the practice note doesn't do away with.
I think nobody's expecting a property lawyer to be necessarily factoring, the consequences on price as a result of perceived flood risk or stated flood risk. But I think that the important thing is to recognise that it may exist. If it does exist, there are further inquiries that probably need to be made. With flooding in the UK, often that further interrogation is insurance available. I would strongly recommend anyone, obviously, thinking about the insurance thing, is to make sure that property, if it's on cover, if insurance is available, that is it part of the flood re scheme or not? I think flood re finishes in 2038, I think it is, or 39. Look, there's a scheme now, so the government and the insurance industry has responded to the challenge and put lots of residential property on cover that wouldn't actually necessarily have got insurance for flooding previously, and that's great. But of course, that comes to an end. We need to know about those things.
The wider sort of issue here, though, is that whether it's flood or whether it's heat stress or wildfire, the implication still seems to be it's the role of the conveyancer to identify that risk and identify a way in which it should be remediated, or are there routes to have that done for you effectively? Perhaps it's through a search company or similar.
Yeah, I think so. I think climate risk searches, environmental searches that incorporate climate risk analysis should cover all these perils, and I think that's a challenge that the industry now needs to step up to. We need to move away from this flood being the main / only thing that we consider, to think about these other things like heat stress, wildfire, drought potentially, and others. They can have a material consequence. I mean, clearly the outcome of a wildfire situation might be very different to a heat stress, but nonetheless, this information is readily available. And therefore, I think it's reasonable for property lawyers to have an expectation that when they buy a climate search, that climate search, does the necessary analysis against these different perils to facilitate, an understanding. I don't think anyone's suggesting that the property lawyer is on the hook for working out the sort of impact on value or anything like that. But clearly, is this property insurable is a big question. If we have a manifesting peril, what else, could or should we be doing? At the very least, a buyer should be aware that this is an issue, or could, obviously, importantly, with climate change, be an issue inside the term of their, ownership of that property. These things may manifest in 5, 10, 20 years' time. A property not at risk of wildfire today may be at a different level of risk in the latter stages of the mortgage, perhaps. We have a UK property market based on data primacy, I think, where we like to know the facts rather than just blanket insure things. I think that's right. And of course, in that context, we should understand forward-looking climate hazards. And I think that's a really important thing to think about here, which actually the climate is changing, and therefore our understanding of the past isn't that great in terms of telling us what's going to happen in the future. And that, I think, is an important point to draw out in terms of historically what we've done about flood, which is understand where flooding has taken place and are there flood defences, and that sort of today and backward looking view on flood. Actually, we do need to have a forward looking view on flood. And that, of course, aligns well with how the financial services sector is thinking about this in terms of both insurers and also mortgage lenders, who are doing quite a lot of work to think pretty hard about this and think about what their exposure is.
I mean, therein is kind of one thing that I don't think people fully realise is one of the drivers behind some of this. I think there are some people out there who are firmly of the belief that climate change has been concocted almost by search companies trying to sell more searches. But the reality is this is being driven by a number of different stakeholders.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, David. Yeah, I think, look, and I think that at the top of that pyramid, you've got the mortgage lenders and the insurers, and they are both, they both have their own drivers to do this, both, direct economic market drivers, but also some regulatory pressures that are coming on to them. And I think the average, person buying a home probably does want to know about this. And I think that also increasingly that consumer expectation is changing. I think people expect this kind of stuff to come out in the wash when they're buying a home. I suppose we all know a little bit that the average consumer can be a little bit fall in love with the property and kind of not think too much about the risks or the advice they're being given. It's got this wrong with it, that wrong with it, but climate change these problems are getting worse, not better. And that's important to understand. I think, property might be at a level of risk today. In the future, that's potentially going to be worse. And we probably should have a handle on that. So I think the search companies have got a big role to play here. It's increasingly important that those search products are factoring in expanded and broadened set of perils that we have an understanding for, we have data for, we have knowledge of. That's important. We can't just be thinking here about flood and climate. Actually, there are other aspects to climate change. The financial services sector is definitely all across this and very engaged on it. And I think increasingly consumers' expectation will come into play here. So yeah, I think there are other drivers. I don't think this is an agenda that's being driven by the search industry. And I think the search industry is on a bit of a journey here in just the same way I think as property lawyers are. And the guidance that we have now from the Law Society probably gives us some clarity to work to.
You mentioned that Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, RICS, are also looking at this. There is almost a sense that this lies much more in the surveying community as an issue than it does with conveyancers, because take ground shrinkage as an example, it's going to produce cracks in property, which a surveyor is going to identify, not a conveyancer. Is that the way you see it?
Probably not really. As I said, these climate risks, a surveyor's role obviously is to look at, physically inspect the property and to assess it and make comments about that. We're talking about forward-looking climate risks here. So I think in the majority of cases, in many cases, that those won't necessarily be abundantly obvious to a surveyor in just the same way as they may not be abundantly obvious to a property lawyer. So I think that they've got probably a similar duty of coming their way from RICS, and this is about data and forecasting into the future based on particular climate scenario outcomes, what the risks are likely to be in the years ahead. Of course, obviously, if a property is right next to a river and it's evidence of flooding, then obviously that's something that gets picked up by a surveyor. But I think that we've all got a collective responsibility to be thinking about a property in the context of climate change, because it's almost undoubtedly coming that, there will be situations of, property value impairment as a result of perceived future risks associated with climate. We may not see that necessarily completely in the market today, but it's just a matter of time. So I think that to your point, David, I think surveyors have got a duty as well. I mean, look, I've not read the latest edition of the Red Book and whether RICS has formalised that guidance yet, so I can't actually comment on that. But I think they have a similar duty. I think the other thing to think about is, I'm not sure what the stats are, but a lot of people don't actually get a full survey, do they, when they buy a property? That's another thing to think about. Some people have a valuation only type survey, and I think it's I'm not sure what the percentages are, but I've got a feeling it could be a third or something that actually get a full home buyer survey from a surveyor when they buy. So it's not the place where it's this stuff's necessarily all going to come out in the wash.
That's a very valid point. I mean, last stat I published was somewhere in the region of 1 in 5, and possibly even less than that, 1 in 6 as well. So not a statistic that seems to be on the upward trend either. Is it too simplistic to suggest that we simply exclude climate change from our retainer? You mentioned being really clear in the retainer, using the practice note that's been produced, but is it too simplistic to say, look, we're going to we're just not going to deal with it, and make that really clear in the retainer.
My understanding of the guidance as written is, you can do that. That's a course of action that could be taken. I think that the issues that come with that are that you have to spend probably require quite a lot of effort to convey the point and therefore what the consequences of that are to a consumer. So let's assume this consumer isn't a property expert and it's just a regular person buying a property. That's my understanding of that. You can exclude this from a retainer, but the effort required to kind of convey that message and make sure that that's clear and the consequences of that are understood by the customer is a slightly burdensome amount of effort required for that. And then I think the other thing that comes into play is obviously, some firms may choose not to do this, some will. I suspect that, I know that most, probably more than half, are at the moment already doing this. All things being equal, I suspect that that's unlikely to go backwards. It's likely to increase. I always draw on the comparison with how the contaminated land regulations came out some 20 plus years ago, and obviously the property conveyancing industry responded to that with searches. It took some 10 years, I think, for 95% of property transactions to have a contaminated land search. I suspect that with the advent of increasing use of digital and lots more data, that actually this becomes climate searches, climate analyses going into the conveyancing process becomes a pretty routine thing pretty quickly, I suspect.
I mean, drawing on that point then, Dan, and you're obviously your own experience heading up Groundsure, are there firms that have sort of readily accepted this? They just move forward with it, as you say, as they did with contaminated land, with flooding, with planning, with energy and infrastructure, or whatever it might have been, and therefore is it the minority in your view that are making the noise around this, or have property lawyers got a point here? Is this the straw that breaks the camel's back?
Back in 22, when products were first launched and the Law Society issued some guidance, that I think that there was a bit of a discussion and a debate, wasn't there, around why are conveyancers, property lawyers being asked to do this? And I think the point was, well, look, there are clearly some direct legal liabilities that flow from this climate risk stuff, and therefore it's probably in scope. But property lawyers are not climate experts. No one's expecting them to be, but there's a solution, and most of the time that solution is get a search, and that's not different to many other aspects of the conveyancing process where we have things that need covering off that we have a search for, or a check, or checks and balances for. This is an extension of that. So I think that the point is really, look, yes, a bit of new obligation that builds out from the obligations that already existed around contaminated land and historic flooding. We already had those, and the market will respond with new products, and they'll come from different providers. I think the market will adjust, and there'll be competition, and that's good for property lawyers because they'll have competitively priced products. The improvement and the evolution of those products will drive forwards, and this will just become a standard part of the environmental search process, I suspect. Look, based on my experience over the years, as I said, I think previously off the cuff, I'd say that more than half of property lawyers are incorporating a climate assessment of some degree already. And so given that we've only had this kind of guidance, beginning to evolve for the last 2 and a bit years, I think that's pretty good going. And I think, in a couple of years further down the line, this will just be routine and we won't even be probably talking about it. There'll be lots of different products in the marketplace. They will cover a wide range of perils, more than we see today. So things like wildfire being included, heat stress, etc. And that's good for the market. That's good for people buying homes. These searches come back pretty quick. They're certainly not the thing that delays transactions. Many things do, these don't. And in most cases, look, most properties are not affected by these things, but understanding that they are not affected and they are in the clear is useful information for the buyer, for the buyer's future sale position, for the mortgage lender. Surely we make better decisions if we're more informed and we have the data at our disposal. And it seems a pretty obvious thing to do to incorporate it into the environmental search.
So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here, Dan, but you welcome the practice note. You think it's a good thing from the Law Society, complements the guidance that was there previously? I
think the guidance that was there previously was very general for anyone practicing solicitors. Generally, the guidance is specific for property lawyers, so I think that's good. What it clearly says demarcates what's expected, and therefore, as a consequence, what's not expected. I think it gives everybody clarity, and I think that can only be a good thing. And I think the other thing I'd say is that, whilst I'm not was never part of the editorial panel, I know that this has been poured over by a lot of very experienced, well-knowledged lawyers, property lawyers, environmental lawyers, and input from other stakeholders. It's taken some time, but I think the consequence of that is that there's a well-drafted practice note that probably covers most of all the salient points. I think it's a good thing. I think it gives everyone clarity. It's pretty well drafted and easy to follow. So I think it's good.
And I don't like to finish on a negative, and I hope this doesn't come across in a particularly negative way, Dan. But the direction of travel here is that there doesn't seem to be a choice over whether the profession deals with this additional responsibility or not. You've described it as an evolution, as a similar kind of journey that we went on with some of the other environmental searches that are now pretty commonplace. But the bottom line here is that the profession doesn't seem to have a choice in whether it deals with this or not.
I suppose I just go back to the point, which is, look, property in the UK is affected by the climate, and it will be increasingly affected by the climate. And we have models and data to tell us and forecast that into the future. So do we want to be a market where people buy blind, or do we want to be informed when we make a buying decision? And as we've covered already, the financial services industry, both insurers and mortgage lenders, are already looking at this stuff, and they're looking at this stuff a lot. And therefore, look, I think it's important that as a prospective buyer, this information is shared and made available. And therefore people make better informed decisions about the property as a result. I don't think anybody would recommend, or I wouldn't recommend buying property without a survey. Some people, as we've already touched on, some people do. As somebody in and around property and data, I would be doing all the possible checks and balances. I'd want to see all the checks and balances I possibly could to help me make a better decision. I appreciate that that's not always everybody's view, and sometimes people want to buy as quickly and as cheaply as possible without doing any of these things. But I think that's not necessarily the most common sense and pragmatic way to go. But I think that most people, if you ask most people, this is, you can't argue with the fact that this is most probably a good thing. And seeing the evolution of this and some demarcation, we've got some clear guidance now. It's pretty clear what people should be doing, what the expectation is. And I think that clarity should help everybody. So I would look at your slightly negative thing at the beginning there, David, and say, well, I think this is a positive thing.
As I say, whether you take what I said as negative or put a positive spin on it, Dan, it's very much here to stay, and there's no two ways about it. I think lawyers have to tackle this climate change issue here and now. And the practice note is a useful reference point for them in terms of, if we go back to the beginning of the conversation, what it does say, and importantly, what it doesn't say. Really, really appreciate you joining the podcast, Dan, and sharing your insight.
Thank you for having me, David. It's been a pleasure, and of course, this is a bit of a big milestone, so to speak. Yeah, great to pine on it and share a few views and chat it through. So thanks very much for having me.
The Today's Conveyancer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysconveyancer.co.uk. My thanks to Dan. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.